The reason I chose the title is because anyone who's a sailor knows the term red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky in the morning, sailor take warning. And so I chose the title because I thought it best represented a phenomenon that I had seen through living in Hawaii, knowing Maui people, having been to Tahiti, having spent time on the coast of Peru. I saw this recurring or odd thing, which was that red hair seemed to show up in deep antiquity. So this is the area of influence that I'm going to discuss. It's the Polynesian area called the Triangle and the coast of Peru over here. Now, Thor Heyerdahl, who of course was the man behind the Kon-Tiki, he did a fair bit of research from reading oral traditions from South America, where it spoke, or they spoke, of this ancient people who were red-haired, light-skinned, and they were ancient travelers from Peru into Polynesia. He was vehemently attacked by academia for it, and by the Polynesians themselves, because both said, no, the Polynesians came from Southeast Asia, and they were the only people to inhabit what is called Polynesia. Now, he proved that it was possible with a very simple raft with a sail in 111 days to go from Callao, Peru to Polynesia without steering it. They didn't bother trying to steer it. They just wanted to see what the winds and currents would do, and it took them to Polynesia, and he became world famous after that. The island that really took his interest after that, and which he thought he would have been able to have sailed to, is Rapa Nui, also called Easter Island, which is the southern part of Polynesia. And because of the winds and currents that exist in the Pacific, they're never static, they're dynamic. So over the years, different currents can change position, and you can, without too much difficulty, sail from Peru today to Rapa Nui. Oops. Sorry, I'm having trouble with this machine. Oh. Sorry, the computer's frozen.
No, it has crashed.
Uh-oh.
That might have overheated. Okay. Yeah.
I want to restart?
The mouse isn't working either.
Wow.
Okay, just have to...
So any questions about the Inca while we're waiting?
Do you want to...
No, please, somebody, Hugh? Because I know nothing about how these work when they don't work. And that's the great thing, you just turn them off and turn them on. So if anyone has any questions, no, somebody get a microphone for the audience, because I don't know what to do. Okay. Okay, sorry. I'm the voice. Okay.
So we've got an early question and answer session, it seems. Anyone?
Yeah, we'll do it.
I can't actually see anyone. Oh, I've got one. I've got trouble.
On the larger rocks, the early construction phase, there are several small nubs or knobs on the rock. Would you care to comment on them? Do you think they're during part of the construction, or were they left on for decoration or anything? Do you have any thoughts on those?
That is one of the best questions in existence, because at a number of places, especially Ollantaytambo, you have these odd-looking knobs that stick out. And the same thing in Egypt. And the conventional story is that the Inca did that in order to be able to help raise the stones up. So by having the knobs there, you could loop a rope there, and then that would help to hoist it up. Now, the question I had was, well, then why didn't they cut them off afterwards? Because if the precision joinery is so perfect, why would they leave something aesthetically ugly like that? No answer. The other thing is that some of the largest blocks don't have these knobs. It's more likely that they represent some kind of solar markers, because they don't tend to be on a northern side. They tend to be on the east, south, and west. So it's as if as the sun is moving, these knobs on different days cast different shadows, relating possibly one to another. Or they could represent star systems or something, or constellations or stars. But it's one of the, I don't mean to demean conventional archaeology, but when they go out of their box and try to answer questions like kind of dumb ways like that, well, it's a way to lift the stones. It's like, that's a hell of a lot of work just to get that knob in the first place means you have to remove all of the stone around it. They would have thought of something more intelligent as a lifting aid than that. The thing is that not only are there the knobs, but there are also in some places concave areas, like at Sacsayhuaman. And then you say, well, if the knobs were for lifting them, then what are these depressions for? And they say, well, you take a tree trunk, and when you're trying to lift the stone up, that's a place where the tree can be, the end of the piece of wood can go. So again, you can push these 40-ton stones into position. Another thing, honestly, it's not that it offends me. It's just that's why I bring engineers in and ask engineers, how would you have achieved this? Because an engineer is an engineer. An archaeologist is not an engineer. An archaeologist is also not an expert on spiritual things. And when archaeologists get into things about, well, the Inca believed this, it's like, based on what? Well, because we think the cat represents a so-and-so. It's like, have you asked the actual people? And finally, before I start this again, that's what really offends me is when so-called scholars, or scholars, if you want, whatever, scholars, when they don't ask the descendants of a people their story, that's racism. You want to know how the Inca lived? Ask the Inca, or the descendants of them, or the Rapa Nui, or anybody on Earth. That's where you get the story, not from, well, we're digging and we think this pot represents something. It's like, come on. That's childish at this point. It's 21st century. Anyway, now that I've had my rant.
Okay, we're going to do the questions at the end now.
Okay, yeah,
the
sorry.
talk's back online. Okay.
So on Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, you find these amazingly huge heads. And later on, or soon, very soon, we'll get into the fact that they're not just heads, there's more to them. But for some reason, amongst the Polynesian people, it was supposedly the people of Rapa Nui who were the only major megalithic sculptors, and some of these are 30 feet tall. Now again, the conventional story of the populating of the Americas is that everybody, and that means absolutely everybody, crossed the Bering Land Bridge during the Ice Age from Siberia and traveled all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. All the way down to Tierra del Fuego, which is down here, by walking, because these people were too stupid to know how to sail. That is what they're inferring. In places, and this is my place of greatest interest, is Paracas. You have skull after skull that have red hair. Native Americans have black hair, without exception, as far as I know. But for some reason, on the coast of Peru, and also in Polynesia, you find not only stories of ancient people with red hair, you have people walking around that still have red hair, not descendants from people who mixed with Irish and Scottish people, but some ancient race. The conventional story of the populating of Polynesia is that they came from Southeast Asia, and then down through Tonga and Samoa, about 150 AD, or the numbers change all the time, and they get to the Tahiti area, they go to the Marquesas, and then they branch out north to Hawaii, southeast to Easter Island, also called Rapa Nui, and southwest to Aotearoa, which is called New Zealand. However, that's not what the native people say, but again, native people don't tend to be asked, the story of their actual history. And it's because I've been involved with native people all my life that this offends me. So this is what's called the Polynesian Triangle. And in general, these people all have the same bloodline, more or less, from Hawaii to Rapa Nui to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and everything in between. They're all the same family of people. The odd thing is that Thor Heyerdahl, who was fascinated by this ancient story of the existence of this red-haired ancient people, who he dangerously said were white-skinned, which automatically offended the native people, but he found, as well as the Maui structures, he found constructions underground, like this one, which are megalithic, and have since been reburied because the people of Rapa Nui don't want their ancient constructions to be exposed to the elements because they break down rapidly. They will re-begin excavations on their island when they choose to do so. But one phenomenon that existed, again, are these giant Moai figures, and on top of some of them are these top knot things. Some people have speculated that they're hats, but actually it's more likely that that was the color of the hair of the first people. Now, there are the stories of this character called Viracocha, or Kontiki Viracocha. That's where Thor Heyerdahl got his Kontiki from, is Kontiki Viracocha, who was a Peruvian ancient person or people who were seafarers. And supposedly the origin of these people was again this intriguing island of the sun, where again you have these, the gate of the sun. And on the gate of the sun, you have this character, which is the Kontiki character, Kontiki Viracocha. And that's more of a expanded representation. He's holding these two odd objects in his hands. And one thing which I wish to address is when people say that he's crying tears, those are not tears, those are actually puma shapes. But especially UFO people or Atlantis people say that he's crying for some lost land, and that's not true. They are artistic representations of pumas, but the meaning is we've lost. This shows you the position of where Tiwanaku and basically the island of the sun is. Again, it's a very sophisticated place of antiquity. Some speculate, as Poznansky did, using the obliquity of the ecliptic, which is similar to precession. He stated that he thought it was at least 15,000 years old. Conventional archaeologists destroyed his career because of that. They say it's 2,000 years old, but they can't explain how it was built and what technology was used because, again, most of them aren't engineers, and it's up to engineers to solve engineering problems in my mind. But you do have this character, this Viracocha character, with some kind of headgear on. And here you have a pot. And it might be a stretch, but I think that headdress looks very similar to the top knot that we see on Rapa Nui. And again, as I just showed you, because normally these are two separate talks, but at the Coricancha in Cusco and Machu Picchu and places, you have this incredible level of stone technology, stone working in massive pieces of stone or blocks of stone. And again, this is on Rapa Nui. This is the only example. It's called Vinapu, and the precision is as good as anything in Cusco. It's all by itself, amongst other rougher construction. It faces west, and it hints to me that somebody was there before the Polynesians got there and did some building. Now, on the coast of Peru, when the Spanish arrived, they found seafaring craft with sails. This possibly could be a more realistic interpretation of these sailing craft, and the Spanish were quite in shock to see these rafts like flying past them. They eventually stopped them, and that's how they found out where the Inca lived, but that's a different story. But one of the strange things is that in Polynesia, you find the sweet potato. The sweet potato is indigenous to the Americas, specifically Central and South America. So people are always questioning, how did the sweet potato get to Hawaii and New Zealand? It didn't float. And this is a representation of the sweet potato that has been found made out of coral in Hawaii. And it's also found, the Maori people of New Zealand talk about the fact that the sweet potato has been there basically forever, as shown here with very expensive dog food, herb duck confit and sweet potatoes. But also something that's found in Lake Titicaca, again, where the Viracocha character comes from, as well as the coast of Peru. Here, this is a boat being made out of this one reed called totora. And totora is found, like I said, in Titicaca, the coast of Peru, where they still make these little boats out of. But it's also found in this lake on Rapa Nui. No one knows how long it's been there. The Rapa Nui people used to build boats out of it. And elsewhere on the coast of Peru, you have representations of the ancient people, in this case the Moche people, having traveled on the Pacific, possibly great distances, not just up and down the coast. And this is the story that one of the great Inca, Tupac Yupanqui, traveled. He took 2 years, and he traveled to 2 mysterious islands. And he was living in Ecuador at the time. But he disappeared for 2 years on these balsa craft, visited 2 mysterious islands, and brought strange things back that were not native to Peru. So it's believed that he possibly went to... that he possibly went to both the island of Mangareva and also the island of Isla de Pascua, which is Rapa Nui, and then returned home. The great Peruvian archaeologist Julio is the father of Peruvian archaeology. And he did a lot of work on the coast of Peru, as well as at other sites, such as this one called Chavin, which was thought to be the oldest civilization in Peru until a place called Corral was found. Chavin was thought to be 3,000 years old. Corral is at least 5,000 years old. But the more the work that I and others are doing, we think the history of Peru goes back before the end of the Ice Age. Now, my place of interest is a little town on the coast called Paracas. That's where we find these elongated skulls with red hair. And also very incredibly complicated artwork. These people are thought by most archaeologists to have been very simple people, but their textiles were the most complex and oldest found in Peru. This is an example of one of the skulls we have in the Paracas History Museum. And the photo isn't as good as it could be, but that is red hair. That is not hair that is oxidized or been dyed. That is natural auburn hair, which glints red in the sun. And these people have very odd-looking skulls, which oral tradition has told me also did at one time exist on Easter Island. Very elaborate ways of burying their dead. And this characteristic, this thing called the Candelabra, which is a geoglyph 600 feet tall, if you turn it upside down, it is the mirror image of the Southern Cross. The Southern Cross is the navigational instrument if you're into star navigating in the Southern Pacific Ocean. And Senior Juan Navarro and I both believe that the Paracas made that figure as a homing beacon after they had traveled great distances. Unfortunately, the Paracas have no descendants and have not had direct descendants for 2,000 years. They left no written record. They've left me with the challenge of figuring out who they were. But what we do know is they traveled at least to Ecuador, because this shell, called spondylus, is only found off the coast of Ecuador, and it's found in Paracas burials. And it's more likely that the Paracas sailed north because the prevailing winds are from the south most of the year, and then reverses and comes back down, than walking all the way to Ecuador and back. Again, this shows you another representation of two Paracas skulls. One's a baby, and possibly the mother. Photo's not that great, but they had red hair. The Nazca people, who were the supposed descendants, loosely, of the Paracas, had natural red hair, as is also shown in this Paracas culture mummified head. There is a culture called the Chachapoyas, who are called the warriors of the clouds, and they have erroneously been said to have been red-haired people. They weren't. They were light-skinned people, but especially in a lot of New Age writings, people talk about these mystical people who were red-haired, but they weren't. Again, this shows you the theoretical thought of pattern as to the migration of the Polynesians from Southeast Asia to the Marquesas, to Tahiti, Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. I worked for 2 years on a project in Hawaii building one of these. It's a 62-foot voyaging canoe. So I learned star navigation. I learned a lot about the origins of the Hawaiian and other Polynesian people, and I was taught by old Hawaiian women whose knowledge has never been written down because they regard this knowledge as theirs, and has not been written in books. But I did meet this man who was the last of the great star navigators, Micronesian, but he guided this one great canoe from Hawaii to Tahiti and back solely using the stars. And it's been replicated ever since, including from New Zealand to Tahiti to Hawaii, and from Rapa Nui to Tahiti to Hawaii. Now again, the conventional thought is that there were people called the Lapita who came from Southeast Asia, and that they were the mother culture of the Polynesians, but the Polynesians say that's not the story. There is an island on Raiatea, or there's a site on Raiatea called Tapu Tapuatea. That was, up until the 14th century, the central place where all Polynesian people from throughout the Pacific would meet yearly to discuss the affairs, family affairs, because they were all one giant family. Conventional wisdom, again, says that the people of Rapa Nui were the last of the Polynesians to move from Tahiti to Rapa Nui, but the oral traditions of the Rapa Nui people themselves and the Maori people, and to some degree the Hawaiian people, say that their origin is Rapa Nui, and that all the rest of the Pacific was migration started in Rapa Nui and then went off in those directions. Therefore, I think maybe their original homeland to some degree was South America. Again, we have the representation of the red hats, which are not hats. It's actually the way they used to wear their hair. Now, what we're looking for in November is Dr. Robert Schock, who was able to date the Sphinx at being older than Pharaonic Egypt, to come to Rapa Nui and for the first time tell us how old these sculptures are, because they aren't just heads, they're full bodies. You only see that part, but the rest of the body is buried, such as this, which most people don't know. And of course, the question is, how and when were they built? Oral traditions say one thing. I want confirmation from Dr. Robert Schock to tell me what he thinks based on erosion. Again, this shows you the one example on Rapa Nui of almost perfect joinery that we find in South America. Again, I think confirming the possibility that part of the bloodline came from there. And one fallacy about Easter Island is that people have written about some civil war that happened, and that prior to Captain Cook, who is pictured here in the middle, that when he arrived there, that the whole society was in decay. These people were into cannibalism, and there was a civil war and they destroyed each other. That's not the case. It's too much information for me to be able to tell you in this presentation, but the oral traditions say it was after contact with the white people, as in Roggeveen, who was the Dutchman who named Easter Island. It was accidental, but as soon as they had contact with the Europeans, their society collapsed because it's the most isolated island inhabited in the world. And Hawaii was devastated, but Rapa Nui was basically destroyed. The population dropped from 5,000 to 111 people. Fortunately, now the population's up to about 5,000. This shows you again that these aren't just heads. These are full bodies that go all the way down. And this is what Polynesian headgear looks like. This is Hawaiian, but the Tahitians were very similar. And this is a top knot. That's Maori. But that reflects the ancient tradition of how they wore their hair. And that's what we see in this. And coincidentally, Irene and I went to Rapa Nui in February, and we saw this guy. And this man, is from the Tuki clan. And they're not part Scottish, they're not part Irish. This is an ancient bloodline. And all of the Tuki clan have got this color of hair. That's just... Another fallacy is about this language called Rongo Rongo. It's the only hieroglyphic language in Polynesia. So some people say, for some bizarre reason, that the last of the Polynesian migrations, which was to Rapa Nui from Tahiti, for some reason they decided to invent a language. Highly unlikely. It's more likely there is a similar language in Peru that looks like this, and in Panama that looks like this. It's more likely that people migrated from the Americas to there, and they had this language, but this was the first migration. When the Polynesians arrived, this was possibly hidden from them, but some of the Rapa Nui people say that they still can read this, even though Western scholars say that they've tried for 100 years and can't figure it out. The thing is, the Rapa Nui people know, but they have not been asked in a kind and gentle way what the representations of their language is, so they're not going to tell anybody. This just gives you, again, the size of Polynesia, and the fact that traveling from one island to another is not that difficult. You island hop, for example, from Easter Island or Rapa Nui to Pitcairn, and then from Pitcairn, using the currents and the winds. The currents and the winds are basically running in the same direction. They guide you from Pitcairn to Tahiti in the winter, but in the summer, the currents change direction. So if you want to go back from Polynesia to Peru, in some cases you can do that. So it's more likely that these ancient people traveled they bounced or they jumped from island or island hopped to Rapa Nui, to Pitcairn, to Polynesia, again where the central giant Tapu Tapu Atea Marae was. There is residual sculpture that we find in the Marquesas in Tahiti. So massive sculpture in Rapa Nui, some in Tahiti, basically none out of stone at least in Hawaii, and basically none in Aotearoa or New Zealand. So it's like knowledge began to disappear the farther from home they went. This is just supposedly what the people of Tahiti originally looked like. And these are mildly megalithic constructions, seemingly shaped stones in the Tahiti Marquesas area. A brilliant book written by Native Hawaiians talk about the first Hawaiians, who were these red-haired people. And this book is in very small circulation, but still. On the island of Kauai, which is the last in the chain of the Hawaiian Islands, we find megalithic construction, or at least the ability to sculpt and shape stones. and also these massive ponds that were made by these mysterious so-called Menehune people, who have been comically portrayed this way, but I believe they were normal-looking people who had red hair and were devastated by the Tahitians who came as warrior chiefs and wiped them out, except the little memory remains in the oral tradition. This woman is Hawaiian. She has this natural color of red hair. Now, what happened with these first Hawaiians is that the Tahitians came from the south. And so these people, called the Menehune, retreated north as far as they could go until they reached a little atoll to the northwest, and they left megalithic construction. And this island doesn't have any water, supposedly. They also left carvings, and this man is one of the descendants. Unfortunately, he's wearing a hat, so we can't see his hair, but the oral traditions say that the last of the Menehune, when these Hawaiian warriors were approaching them, the few that were left, they left from this atoll and decided to go home, and home was Rapa Nui. Now, in New Zealand, there still are people who have this native reddish-colored hair, but they're presently being persecuted by the government and by some Maori people because they seemingly represent an earlier culture than the Maoris themselves. And since some of the Maori are into land claims, the last thing they want is somebody else to claim that they're the original people when it's necessary for their land claims that they're the original people. But I'm looking very much forward to going to, not stir up too much because I have a lot of Maori friends, but I really want to go to New Zealand and meet with some of these people and just hear the story they have to tell, because I find it very intriguing. And this young woman is an example of one of these red-haired, through all these hundreds of years, it still shows up once in a while. This is possible megalithic construction that exists in New Zealand, but any of these sites have been shut down by the government on behalf of certain Maori tribes who don't want anyone looking at anything that could be previous to their having landed in Aotearoa. And of course, people love to talk about this ancient lost continent of Mu. Geologists say emphatically, and honestly I believe them, I don't think there ever was a continent in the Pacific. I think because you have to get into the mindset of these people. They're not Europeans. We think in a certain way. It doesn't mean that all people think the way we think. The Polynesians have always been ocean people. Hawaiians spend half their time, whenever they can, in the water. They're so at home with it that I think their concept of their ancient homeland was water-based, but that every little dot or every city is the equivalent of an island, so it's almost the reverse. But that's what I think ancient Mu or Lemuria was not this devastating thing that caused a continent to sink. I think what happened was that at the end of the Ice Age, the oceans around the world rose by 350 feet, and so certain islands disappeared, and that the entire chain of islands of Hawaii were either connected or so close together, a little continent. And the Hawaiians themselves subtly say that they have lived there for 25,000 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Brien. So we now have time for a few questions. There's one already. Here we go.
Hello. Have you got any comments on the birthing stones in the middle of Oahu, the big red stones where the king had to be born in order to be king?
Oh, those are called the birthing stones. Yeah, they're amazing. They're megaliths, basically, seemingly shaped, and there are only a few of them. And not that many people know about them, but if you go and which they don't like, but if you take a stone and you hit them, they ring like bells. And they say that that's the place where the royal kings would be the place where the birthing would take place. I think those are much older than the so-called Hawaiians, which I think of as the Tahitian people who came in the 12th century. I think we're not doing justice to our ancestors in general by making up what I think are silly stories of our civilization beginning 6,000 years ago. We're too smart for that. Our ancestors are too smart for that. They would have developed all sorts of things before that. How could we possibly have gone from hunter-gatherers and then in 6,000 years we're exploring the moon? I think we're not doing justice globally to what ancestral people did. And especially in places like Peru and Polynesia, the more you research, or almost anywhere, or Egypt or anywhere, you see examples of ancient cultures that existed before the so-called dominant cultures. And in a case like Egypt, which I haven't been to, but still, most of the people who live in Egypt are not descended from the pharaohs. It's like most people in Rome are not descended from the Romans. But people love to go, well, I'm a Roman. And it's the same in Peru. People go, well, in Cusco, especially because it's great for tourism, my Inca ancestors have taught me, this is what the guides often say, because that way they'll make more money. We're being guided by an Inca. The majority of the Inca are gone. They were gone before the Spanish arrived. Irene and I have met 2 people in 6 years who we know are of Inca descent. And they're as tall, most Peruvians are quite small. Very Indio-looking, which is great. But these 2 women are 6 feet tall. And their features, they're mainly Inca because it's been emphatic that you keep the bloodline going. The same with, Queen Elizabeth does that. But they're very tall, they're very sort of European-ishy, Basque-y something looking. But they don't look like the indigenous people. So that's just a point that even Hawaii, I'm sure, like David Hatcher Childress says, and others have said, the oceans in the past were not barriers, they were highways. And what makes us think that it took the construction of a chronometer to figure out how to sail? These people used the stars for thousands of years. I've done that. It's not that complicated. But on a subtle level, I think it's our Euro-racism that makes some of us think that we're the only people who could have pulled this off, when it's obvious people have done this for thousands of years. Sorry.
Any other questions? Yeah, this guy here was first,
I've read, I think Jared Diamond talks about East Island, and he mentions that one of the reasons for their own dissolution was that they cut down all of the forested areas that they had in order to build those statues. Have you ever heard of anything like that?
Yes, I have heard that, and that's a complete lie.
Okay.
The Europeans did not find it defoliated.
Uh-huh.
There are still trees there that have been there for hundreds of years. Again, that's the racism. Irene and I met with the eldest daughter of the royal family, who's been learning her culture since she was 2 years old. And she said Thor Heyerdahl and no archaeologist has ever approached her family to ask their history. Mm-hmm. They love to presume, and they love to make up theories. And then after about 10 years, it's like, well, I need a new theory because my theory's getting boring. So they make up ideas about how the Maui were moved and all this kind of thing, but they never consult the people. Mm-hmm. And that's offensive, because she guided us for 4 days and said, this is how they were cut, this is how they moved, and it's all completely logical. There was no, maybe there was mysticism, but a lot of native stuff is just logical practicalities. Mm-hmm. But that's, again, I hate to overdo it, but it's like, I can't believe it when people go, I'm the world expert on the history of Rapa Nui, when they've never talked to the people who live there.
Another very small question. In Japan, they oftentimes say that an awful lot of research funding is made available for research on the Moai. And in consequence, it seems like certain companies in Japan have a kind of informal copyright on using those statues in different advertisements. Has it ever heard by you?
Sorry?
Have you ever heard that?
Oh, yeah, but the thing is, what the Rapa Nui people, because, They're becoming quite strong now, and Chile, it's part, so quote unquote part of Chile, which means Chile controls it. All food going to Rapa Nui can only travel either by one shipping company or by land airlines, and that's why the cost of living on Rapa Nui is higher than Sweden. It's insane, but they're getting their independence back. And there was one case in point where someone used an image of a moai, which belongs to the royal family of Rapa Nui. They used that in an advertisement, and this woman whose name, she will not let me use her name because it's a delicate issue, but she said they took this company, I think it was a watch company or something, but they took them to court and sued them for $100,000 and won, because they were stealing or misappropriating cultural products of these people. So
Yeah.
the Japanese have come and done some good things in the past, but now the Rapa Nui people, like any people, they want to start doing this stuff for themselves, and that's why the two examples you saw where the excavations were done, and it showed the full bodies, which blew people away, but they immediately afterwards ordered them reburied because the stone isn't that hard in most cases, and so the sun and the salt and the rain quickly erodes them, and they said, these are our cultural artifacts, bury them again. If we choose to have them, re-excavated, we will conduct the excavations because it's our island. And as a final point, I just want to say, I guess I'm a proponent for the Rapa Nui now, but there is a moai, which is about this tall, in the British Museum when you walk in. That was stolen from that island by British sailors aboard a ship called the Topaz. And it was given to King George VI, I think, who then gave it to the British Museum. That belongs in Rapa Nui. It's not an artifact for a museum. It's a cultural being from that island, and they want it back because I was told by them they have stolen something from us. They should return it. And I think at this time in our history, it's time on some level to do that. Certain things that people whose ancestors made should be returned to them. If there are 10 of them, you can keep 9, but give the ones back that they ask for. Colonialism has to end now. We're all one people on this earth. And this stuff can't, you can't study, and especially human remains. Some museums still have people's heads. That's why my big drive is with the elongated skulls of Paracas. They do not leave Paracas. And even when people ask, well, could you bring one to show here? It's like, the skull doesn't want to go traveling. This is somebody's head. This is somebody's ancestor. So thank you for letting me rant.
Any more questions from the audience? Yeah.
Hello. I was wondering, have you done any research at the site of Amurrumaru, and what are your thoughts on it?
I honestly am not that impressed.
Okay.
It looks great. For those who don't know what Amurrumaru is, it's a red sandstone wall. And it's got these 2 channels that come down either side, or one on either side of it, and this cutout doorway. The thing is, people say, well, the Atlanteans made that, or the people of Mu made that, or these people of master technology made that. You can see the marks where the stone hammers were to shape it. It's beautiful to look at. Maybe parts of it are super ancient, but it's become too much of a clichéic place for people to go and think it's a portal or doorway they're going to enter. It's like, I don't think so. It's a neat thing. There are weirder things around Cusco that may actually be portals because they look like not lasers, but some kind of machine cut these cubes out that you can stand into and put your chakras against this living rock. But Amurrumaru, I think, is just becoming too hyped, for me. For you, it might be the way to Alpha Centauri, so.
The larger constructions, the older ones, at places like Ollantaytambo and Tiahuanaco, have you any idea how the people who built these constructions got those huge stone slabs up the mountain? Would it have been like the Egyptians with a ramp making the pyramids?
There is a ramp there, supposedly, but it might simply be a ceremonial causeway. We don't know. That's why I love bringing engineers there, because, I can show them. The quarry is there. These are the tools they had. They had to move it down this little trail, unless they decided to, drop them off the cliff into the river. Then they had to cross the river. Then they had to go up several hundred feet, and then shape these things and erect them and make them fit like,
Yes.
like two hands. And they just say, no, or I don't know. But in February, we had a guide who took us up there, and I'd been there so many times, I was getting arrogant about my knowledge level. And he said, this is how they cut the stone. And we literally saw where a saw mark is into it, as if somebody had cut from a loaf of bread, and 2/3 or 3/4 of it peeled off and fell down and was removed. But you can still see the saw cut. And I've taken 2 engineers there. They both looked at it, and they've said, I have no idea how they did that without technology, without high technology. And those are, one man's has been an engineer for 20 years, another one for 40 years, and it's wonderful to bring experts like that there and just look at their facial expressions.
And what period would you date? Have they been dated?
They haven't, because like most people know, you can't really date stone. Again, the conventional archaeologists say that the Inca were building this thing, the Sun Temple, and for some reason abandoned it without giving a reason why or when. But what the oral traditions say is that that was there long before the Inca existed, possibly before the end of the Ice Age. And I honestly, as a scientist, believe that. I think we're looking at what they call Atlantean constructions without the Atlantis aspect. But we have to give them some label. We have to give some label to the lost civilizations, and Atlantis is the best I can find so far. But especially in Egypt and in this part of Peru, not Tiwanaku, because it's a godforsaken wasteland. Why anyone would build anything there, I don't know. But the Sacred Valley of Peru and the Nile area, they've been productive agricultural places for thousands upon thousands of years. And I think any sophisticated culture would want to live in one or other of those places.
Right, thank you.
Hello. You showed a slide with the population, coming over from the Bering Straits down through North America, then to South America, and sounded skeptical about that. Were any other ideas where you think that people...
I'm sorry, your accent is so
where
thick.
do
I'm
you
a
think-
pathetic North American.
Where do you think then the people, possibly, if not the Bering, coming over the Bering Straits, where would they have come from to South America?
Well, I think obviously people cross the Bering Land Bridge. It's a land bridge. But when some academics are so vehement about that's the only way, they aren't looking at the oral traditions or how simple it is to build a craft. Thor Heyerdahl took an expert from Lake Titicaca, an old Indian man, to Egypt to build the Ra, because the Egyptians didn't have a clue how to build a giant reed ship. This old man from Lake Titicaca who built them 10 feet long. Thor Heyerdahl said, will you come to Egypt and build one? And he said, yeah, okay. Okay, but I need it to be 65 or 80 feet long. And he said, yeah, okay. So you want me to make a big one? The man's a boat builder. It's not a sense of I can't build it. It's like, you want a big one? Okay, well, we make more bundles and put them together as more bundles. And that was the man behind that. And the reason why we don't have evidence is because these are organic materials. So Totora lasts 10 or 20 years and then it's gone. So when people say, where are these great ships you're talking about? You're not going to find anything. The sails are cotton. the masts are wood, the hulls are made out of totora. There is nothing left behind. What I'm looking for are artistic depictions of them, so that we can find a trail of movement.
Thank you. Back with the Bering land corridor has been exposed. There are some theories that the corridor will be so devoid of vegetation and animals it will be impossible to move through there and survive. But there is another theory that there was an immigration into America from the European continent by hopping along the ice sheet. Would a similar situation exist in the Pacific? And would there be any chance of them hopping along the ice sheet, landing on the ice floes to make their way to North America?
Very much so. And I think what we have to look at is we're not looking at one migration of people. We're looking at multiple migrations of multiple people from all over the place. It's also possible that the Phoenicians traveled to Central America. That's why the Olmecs are so bizarre, because you find these huge heads with African-looking faces or also Southeast Asian-looking faces. But if you look at the currents, the wind and the ocean current patterns, it's easy to sail. I think they call it the straight shot or something from Europe, right to the Gulf of Mexico. And the same thing, there's this thing called the Victoria Maui race that happens every May. It's a 5-day straight shot downwind from Victoria, BC to Hawaii. And the Haida people of the west coast of Vancouver Island say we are related to the Hawaiians because once a year we would travel. We would take 2 of our big canoes, make a catamaran out of it, have a giant sail, and we would sail straight to Hawaii, stay there until the wind changed direction, which was in the winter. Then we would sail north off of Japan and then sail east and go home. And that's what we're missing in conventional history, is the fact that we're damn clever people collectively as humanity. And it's through the DNA testing, that we'll see how complex all these different migrations were. And will be intrigued for the rest of my life to try to figure out the tiny little bits that I can, because it's just so cool.
Hello, Brien. I know you talk an awful lot about the Rapa Nui culture and the Indians of the coast and the cultures of the coast in Peru and Chile and around there, to talk about the ancient sites and the elongated skulls and their history. Have you talked to any of the Quero Indians in the mountains and in the Andes about the knowledge that they have of how these things were built and the history of their culture? Have they told you anything that has not been published yet?
Of the people of the Andes?
Yeah, the Quero Indians and
the Queros?
and the Kiowas and all the different indigenous groups in the Andes, the Aymaras.
Yeah, I'm just starting to get into that. There are some, as far as I know, some preconceived things about the Queros. They're being like hyped a little too much now, because they're being spoken of as being the spiritual descendants of that they're the descendants of the Inca, and that's probably not true. They're probably the spiritual descendants. I don't think they're probably genetically related, but they're not the Inca. They're little tiny people. So the trouble is that because of the church and the way some Peruvians are still acting, especially those who are Spanish people, they're trying, the Inca are hyped in Peru because it brings in billions of dollars a year in tourism. Most Peruvians know almost nothing about their history, which is very sad. So even the tour guides in Cusco have to go to tour guide school. And the only thing they're allowed to talk about is what is in Western academic books. They're not really supposed to talk about their oral traditions, which is weird, but that's how the state still has control over, after 500 years, over the native population of the people. But yeah, I would love to meet, I've met Quero people, but I haven't been able to meet with them yet, because I think maybe now I've got enough knowledge to be able to approach them and ask them intelligent questions, but it's taken 6 years. You can only approach, I think, certain native or levels of native knowledge once you have a good background. So I think I would love to meet with the Karo if they will speak. In general, they're incredibly humble people, and they're thought of by some people in Cusco as being second-class citizens because they're too Indio, they're too native. So that's the problem, again, in Peru, like any country that has a mixed population, has that, is that some people love, their native heritage, but some people want to not suppress it, but not try to express it too much, because it's like, this is the 21st century, and let's get into cell phones and get a real job. Indian stuff's like in the past. But if you forget your past, you don't have a future, in my opinion. So.